If you've seen my previous videos, you'll have seen me installing multi-room HDMI distribution to all my TVs. So in this video, we're going to be talking about how we're going to control all of that with these Sofabaton universal remotes. When it comes to universal remotes at the moment, there aren't many very good options. Historically, the Logitech Harmony series was seen as the best universal remote and it was an absolutely brilliant product, but they killed it off a few years ago and haven't really replaced it with anything suitable. And then when it comes to other devices on the market, there aren't that many good options for my sort of use case. There's either your basic one-for-all type remotes, which are just a basic remote that you can program a bunch of codes onto, looking up codes in the manual and typing them in, and they maybe have a button to switch to different input sources, but that's really it. They're not that powerful. Or there's the IR blaster type devices where you have an IR blaster that connects to an app on your phone and you use the phone as the remote. Neither of those really work for me. I want a physical remote, but something that I can really easily configure and put a lot of configuration into to make it very easy to control all manner of smart home devices, remap buttons, set up macros, easily switch between devices, that kind of thing. And neither of those really do it for me. There's a few other little Kickstarter type projects, such as the Unfolded Circle Remote 2, which looks absolutely brilliant and I really want to get one, but they're very limited quantity, pre-release, pre-order type things, so I can't easily get one, let alone three. So realistically, all that really leaves in this space is remotes from Sofabaton. They have two different series, the U series and the X series. The X series is more like the Logitech Harmony type device. It's a separate hub with a separate remote. You use that, use the remote, it syncs to the hub. The hub either talks over Wi-Fi to certain devices, talks over the network, talks to the cloud, or sends out IR signals. But it's very expensive at over £200. It doesn't really do what I kind of need. It, for example, it doesn't have number buttons on the remote, which is something I quite like. And the reviews of it aren't that great. It tends to not get the best reviews. So instead, you have these, which are the U series. And in particular, this is a Sofabaton U2. And these are an interesting product because they're kind of seen as like a smart universal remote, but they're kind of between the sort of higher end smart remotes and a basic one-for-all type remote. Because essentially what you get here is a universal remote that is primarily an infrared remote, although it does support Bluetooth for certain devices, but it doesn't have any sort of Wi-Fi functionality, so it doesn't connect to any cloud services, doesn't connect over the network, doesn't control stuff like that, doesn't allow voice control of your devices. But you can, however, configure it from an app. And that does mean that it makes it very easy to customize this a lot. You can easily remap buttons, you can put buttons from one device on a different device's remote. You can easily set up little macros so it'll do multiple actions with a single button press. And it has a little screen on it that makes it very easy to switch between devices with a name that you can choose. So rather than those sort of one-for-all remotes where you might have 4 buttons to pick the different devices, and they'll have a device name printed on it that probably won't relate to what you've actually got, so you'll have to put it on to press DVD to switch it to control a games console or something stupid. With this, you can actually type in a device name that you want, just to make it a bit easier to use. And these are not as expensive as things like the Logitech Harmony was or the Sofabaton X1. This is round about £60. They're generally quite often on sale, so you're talking round about £60 for one of these. Not insignificant, but not deadly. So in this video, what we'll do is we'll take a look at this, we'll set it up, we'll try it out, take a look at how I'm controlling my home automation system with this, because I'm doing quite a lot of custom integration stuff using this, but also talk about why this is a really infuriating product, because it is so close to being absolutely perfect, but there's just a few minor gripes and annoyances within the app that just really irritate me, and it just could be so much better if they just improved the app. So we'll talk about that as well. So there will be a bit of moaning in this video. I know people don't like when I moan about things for some reason because I'm offending a product, but it is not perfect. There are issues, but it is the best option on the market for me that I can find. And because of that, after buying this one and trying it out a bit, I actually went out and bought another 2 of them. So I can now have one of these in each room. However, if you look at these, you might notice that the boxes are slightly different. The outer 2 are slightly different boxes with a slightly different design of remote. And that's because these are actually the older Sofabaton U1. They're essentially very, very similar products. The U2 is just a slight improvement. So the U2, we'll take a look at them in actually a proper comparison, but the U2 has a slightly refined design. It's a slightly more polished feel. However, I picked these U1s up for about £40, and realistically, for my bedroom and office, they'll be fine because the IR range isn't an issue because you're very close to the TV, and I'm not using them as often, so buying these for so cheap made sense. It'll also allow me to compare them in the video to see it do an actual comparison between the older U1 and the newer U2, so that might be interesting as well. So we'll focus on the U2 generally throughout this video, but I'll do a little comparison between the older U1s as well. So we'll get those out of the way. Now let's talk about this. So first of all, let's take a look at the hardware and then we'll talk about setting this up. So get out the box. I've already had this out the box to play about with it, but if I get that out there, we get manual and then the remote itself, which is quite large, but it does look quite nice. And then finally we get some batteries. And if anyone here is a fan of the DankPods YouTube channel, you'll be very pleased to know we got some genuine puck cells with this. First time we've ever had puck cells come with something, but yep, we have puck cells. So let's get them in. So try and get these open. So now let's get the batteries in the remote. So on the bottom you'll find there's a battery compartment. This is also the difference between the U2 and the U1. The U1's battery compartment is really hard to open, and U2 is a better design, but so we'll take a look at that as well. But yeah, we'll take that out, put the batteries in, like that, and that. And then we can put the battery cover on and see what it does. So if we look around in the front, we'll see on the screen. And we can just about see there, it says connect to the Sofabaton app. Now, unfortunately, this screen is not very bright. It isn't very bright in general. The U1 actually has a brighter screen than the U2. I think they've dimmed it down to save battery. In general use, it's absolutely fine because all you're doing is picking devices on this, and it's easily readable enough, even in a bright room. It's just right now this is under very bright studio light, so it's not that easy to see. But you can just about see there it says connect to Sofabaton app. So realistically with this, to use it, you do need to connect it to the app and then use that to sync your IR codes to it and set the device up. So obviously we need to now get it set up on the app. But what I'll do in this video first of all is we'll take a tour of the hardware of both the U2 and compare that hardware to the older U1 to sort of take a look at the hardware, then we'll get the app set up. In this video, I'll show the app in quite a lot of detail, show the setup process, and go into quite a lot of detail about the app. And then what I'll do towards the end of the video is I'll demonstrate how I'm using these to control my home automation system. So if you don't really care about the app setup stuff, when I get to that point, skip ahead and you'll see all the stuff about my home automation, which is probably more interesting. But I kind of wanted to cover these in a lot of detail for people that are considering buying these so they can see the app experience before they buy it. Because there's a lot of good things, but also a lot of things that aren't great. But anyway, let's first of all take a look at the hardware. So here we have the Sofabaton U2, and here we have the older U1. The U2 is a very, very nice device. It feels pretty well made. It's relatively slippery, but it doesn't feel dreadful at all. And yeah, it looks really nice. Now, if we compare them side by side with the older U1, the best description I would just say is that the U2 is just refined a bit. For example, if you look at the U1, you probably can't really see it on camera, but it's got this quite hard plastic edge here, whereas in the U2, it's a lot more rounded off. And that's generally the difference. The U2 feels a lot smoother and a lot more rounded in the hand. The U1's got quite a sharp edge here and just feels a lot more plasticky. You can definitely tell this is like a sort of initial release of a product, and this is a much more polished version. Aside from that, there's a few other differences. If you notice on the U2, most of these buttons are all kind of split, so you can see like volume up and volume down have a gap in between. The numbers all have gaps in between, that kind of thing. Whereas on the U1, you can see that the numbers have little gaps, but they're all the same bit of material. They're just kind of like a little indent. And the volume buttons and the channel up and down buttons don't have that gap in the middle. So that means it makes it kind of easier to feel for the buttons, I suppose, in the dark. And also, the buttons on the U2 are much lighter to press. On the U1, they're quite a bit stiffer. So yeah, I definitely feel that the U2, the buttons are a lot nicer on the U2 than the U1. And it does feel a lot nicer in the hand. As for other things, as I mentioned earlier, the screen is a bit dimmer on the U2. On the U1, the screen's quite a bit brighter. Now, realistically, in general use, if you're not under bright lights, you'll be fine with both. And I think on the U2, they've dimmed it down to save the battery life. But I also have to say that the screen on the U2 does look a lot better. It looks a little bit sharper and kind of a bit darker. It's got more of a contrast between the light and the black. It looks properly black as the background. This one, it gets quite a lot of haloing around the text. You can tell it's maybe not quite as good a screen. And additionally, the plastic on this, interestingly, is a lot more translucent. So it's probably quite hard to tell on camera, but the plastic isn't actually solid black. It's somewhat translucent. You can maybe just see on the top here, if you look carefully, you can maybe kind of see like a component just above that input button. There's a little component you can see through the plastic. The plastic on the U1 is slightly translucent. The U2 isn't. So I suspect that's also a change. They've maybe made this higher quality plastic on the U2. They've definitely made a lot of improvements. The final improvement I've noticed on the U2 is a battery compartment. So on the U2, it's a battery compartment that you press like that and it opens, and that makes sense. So you look at that and go, well, how's that an improvement? Like, what's special about this? Well, because if you look at the battery compartment on the U1, it's the most stupid design I've seen. Rather than sliding off the bottom, instead, it's got a bit on each side that you have to kind of lever up, and it rips off. And that feels okay, but that's because I've taken it off quite a few times. When I first got this, I couldn't get it off. It was super stiff. So yeah, the U2 is definitely has an improved battery compartment. And you might also be able to see here how it's kind of translucent plastic. You can kind of see my hand behind it there. And likewise, if you look inside the battery compartment there, you can maybe see through it a little bit on the circuit board underneath. So yeah, the U2 is definitely quite a lot nicer hardware. The final difference I found between the two is in terms of battery life and infrared range. In the documentation that Sofabaton published comparing the two, they do mention that the U2 has much better IR range, and I do notice that. Not only is it much longer range, but it also has a much wider beam, so you don't have to be as nearly as directional with the U2 as you have to be with the U1. The U1 you kind of need to point it at the right thing you're trying to control, whereas this you can kind of point it in the general direction and it'll work fine. But what I've also found is that the U2 works over a much longer distance than the U1. And in particular, I think this could be important when it comes to battery life. Because when I was first testing these out, I just put a couple of spare batteries that I had lying around into them. And they were already used batteries that had been used quite a bit and were fairly drained. In the U2, those batteries work completely fine. But then when I moved the batteries into the U1 to test that, I found that it wasn't working over really any significant range. Even a couple of meters, the signal wouldn't work, and I had to get really close to the TV to control it. I put new batteries into the U1, and it worked completely fine. And then putting those new batteries into the U2 gave me an immense IR range. I could stand 5 meters away and it would work completely fine, if not further. So what seems to happen is, obviously, like all remote controls, as the batteries drain, the remote control's range decreases. But because the U2 already has a better range, it means that you could probably get a bit more mileage out of a set of batteries than on the U1, where it'll probably get to a point where it's not really got a good enough range to be usable a bit sooner than the U2 would. So that's just something to bear in mind. The U2 definitely has a significantly better IR range and is potentially better when it comes to having batteries that are slightly drained than the U1, which might need more fresh batteries to kind of get a good range. So you might need to change the batteries in the U1 a bit more regularly. So yeah, the U2 is definitely quite a big improvement over the U1. As for the hardware itself, essentially all you've got is a remote control. You've got a little OLED screen at the top. That just lets you scroll between the inputs. Doesn't have any concept of menus or programmable actions you can put on it or anything like that. It just lists all your particular devices, and then this wheel here scrolls up and down to pick the device that you want to control. You've then got kind of all the buttons you normally expect. You've got numbers, which a lot of these remotes don't have. You've got various sort of navigation buttons, all that kind of stuff. And what's also quite nice is there's this global sort of TV power button. Again, these are all programmable. But what's quite good with this is if you've say got all your different devices here, your TV, your set-top box, your games console, all that kind of stuff, on each of those devices, the power button will probably control that device itself. But what you can do is you can have this button at the top programmed to turn your TV off. So no matter what input device or particular device you have selected on the screen, that's like a global on-off button, which could be quite useful. But yeah, other than that, it's a remote control. It's really not that exciting. So what we'll now do is we'll get the app out, set it up and demonstrate the app on camera, and then we'll go away and take a look at me actually using this to control my home automation system and talk about the setup I did, because I'm doing some stuff here that's a little bit unconventional. But yeah, let's first of all go and take a look at the app, and then we'll take a look at all of that. Okay, so now let's take a look at the app and how we set this up. So here we have the app on my phone, so let's open that up. And now we can have my first moan. The app requires a login. And this is something that is very close to it touches a nerve with me. Because this device is not cloud-based. There's no cloud connection for this. Yes, it downloads IR codes from Sofabaton servers, but that's it. There's no user account required for this, really. There's no reason this should require a user account. The Sofabaton X1, maybe you could argue with that because it can connect to cloud services, Alexa, things like that. But the U-series remotes should not require an account. And the problem is that to use this app, you need to log in. There's no way to get in as a guest, even though all you're doing is setting this up over Bluetooth. And the problem with this is in terms of the longevity of this device. Because for me to log into this app, I need to essentially connect to Sofabaton's servers. If Sofabaton ever shut down, they go out of business, they've dropped support for this app, whatever, they shut down the servers backing this app, there could easily be a situation where I have a remote or 3 of them that works perfectly fine, but because I can't log into the app, I can't configure the device. So that is a pretty big complaint, and it's something that if Sofabaton are watching this video, please add a guest option. Even if the guest option only allows you to configure the U-series remotes, just something so I don't have to log into your app, because it gets really tiring nowadays with the amount of devices that require user accounts that really shouldn't require a user account at a technical level. And this is a perfect example of that. it's a Bluetooth remote that connects Bluetooth to a phone to get configuration, this should not require a user account. So yeah, very, very annoying, but I've got the devices. I mean, I knew this was the case anyway. It's just the only product on the market, so I'm kind of stuck with it. So I'm going to just log into my user account, but put it this way, if there's another similar product to this, even if it cost more but didn't require a user account to log into the app, I'd have gone for that one instead. But anyway, we're now logged in, so let's take a look at it. Just needed to get that out there because that is a bit of a complaint. So when you open the app, it asks you to pick between a U series and an X series remote. In my case, I have the U series, so I'm going to press that. It'll ask for Bluetooth permission, that's fair enough. Yep, that's all fine. And what it now wants me to do is put the remote into Bluetooth pairing mode. So to do that, you hold down the minus and E buttons in the bottom left, and the remote now says pairing on the screen. So with that, the app's now saying you want to connect, so I press connect, give a couple of seconds, and in theory, there we go, I've now connected to the device. So with this, I can now add devices to the remote. So this is where you're going to add all your devices. So for example, if I press add, you can either pick infrared or Bluetooth. So if we take a look at Bluetooth, these are the Bluetooth devices you get. There's not a huge selection. So things like an NVIDIA Shield, that's potentially useful. Potentially Apple, but I'm not sure. It only says Apple. But these are the kind of devices you'll get over Bluetooth. Not that many. Maybe if you've got like Android TV boxes, things like that. But chances are you're going to be using Bluetooth, using IR for this. So for this, we're going to go to infrared, and you've got two options. Either learning, where you'd essentially point your existing remote at this device and then use that to send IR codes. So you press the button on your existing remote, this would learn it and start repeating that. Or searching, where you can look through a database of codes. Now, of course, learning would be very painful. So instead, I'm going to search for codes because that's a lot easier. So this is another slight complaint I would say, is when you come into here, you see all these brands and go, oh, they've got literally everything here. You know, what is Akiko or Alpha Star? You know, all these random brands that I've never heard of. It looks great. There's loads. So that looks really good. But then you'll scroll down these and you'll see, you'll click one of them and find there's actually no codes. So not all of these brands actually have codes associated with them. Of course, that's only on the ones that you've never heard of, so fair enough. So if we find out, look for one that we have heard of, for example, I'll add my office TV into this, for example. So Samsung, pick that. This lists all the Samsung TVs, but then I'll look through this and it won't have my TV. My office TV it's a pretty old TV, I think 2013 or so. It's Samsung F5300, 5300, nothing. And I've checked this before, there's nothing from that series. Likewise, the TV in my bedroom is a Sony, so we go Sony, and it's a Sony KDL 49XE80, so KDL 49XE80. If I look down here, we can look under K, for example. So K, KD, L, scroll through here, and there's nothing. Likewise, if I search XE80, there's nothing. 49. The search is also quite annoying because the search only seems to start from the start of a string, so you can't kind of search part of a model number. But equally, I've looked through this, I can't find my XE80 bedroom TV, which is from about 2017. So yeah, I couldn't actually find codes for my bedroom TV or my office TV in this app. And then another option is Hisense. So you have Hisense TVs, you can come through here, and it does actually have my Hisense A9G, so 65 A9G, which is my living room TV. It has it there. But this doesn't work. For some reason, this doesn't actually seem to work with my living room TV. Don't know why. If it don't, it's maybe a regional difference between a A9G sold in the UK and one sold in a different country. But these codes don't work, which is annoying. However, it's not the end of the world. What I found for each of those TVs is there is some other model on this that does work. So for example, my bedroom TV, generally speaking, if I try most Sony TVs, the codes are kind of the same. So I just find a Sony TV that's got similar functionality and that works. Likewise, the TV in my office, they don't have the Samsung F5300, but I found another Samsung that worked. Likewise for the living room, the Hisense model that I have, the A9G, that didn't work, but I found another Hisense code that did work. So you can kind of figure it out, but you might not be able to just type your model number in and instantly find it. So the way it works, if I say search for Samsung and I find a similar generation of Samsung somewhere in this list. So I've gone through here, and as I mentioned, I can't find my F5300, which the full model number would be a UE32 F5300. But I have found this UE40 F6500, which is getting kind of close. So if I pick that, what's quite nice is it then shows the remote on the screen, And if you look at the remote itself, it says point at your device. So what you can now do is if I point this at my TV off camera, I can then press buttons on it. And in theory, yep, it's now controlling my TV. You can't see this, but that is working. So I'm pressing this button and I am now navigating my TV off camera. So it does mean that this does work. So this code seems to be suitable because it is controlling my TV. So what I can then do is, because I'm happy with that, I can then say next. It then lets me put the name, so I can say it defaults to Samsung. I'll change this to Office TV because that's what it is. It's TV in my office. I can change the picture to something from that set of symbols. Complete. It'll then upload the IR codes to the remote, which takes a minute or so just to do that. Some codes are quicker, some are slower. I think it's literally just how many codes are in the database that it's uploading. So we'll let that happen, and then we'll take a look at it. So there we go, and now it says upload complete. Press complete there, and now it's done. So now if we take a look at the remote itself, you'll see that it has Office TV selected on that screen, and that will now work. So now if I point this at my Office TV off camera, I can now control that. We'll take a look at properly controlling devices later, but that's now working absolutely fine. Now, sometimes I've found this doesn't work absolutely perfectly when you're picking kind of a different remote's a different brand or a different model of TV's code. Certain buttons don't work. In the case of my Office TV, I think it's generally fine with that code, but I found, for example, trying my bedroom TV, which is a Sony, I'd pick another model of Sony Smart TV and it would generally work, but I'd have things like the home button wouldn't work, or the home button would open the main TV settings menu rather than the home screen for all the apps. So you might find it doesn't work quite right. But this is where it being app-based is actually really good, because it makes it very easy to change things around. So here we have this remote. If I go into Office TV, you can rename it, stuff like that, but then we can press remote keys. And you give it a little second to load up, takes a little second, it's not the fastest thing. It then shows all the buttons. So the buttons that are highlighted in green are programmed, so these are programmed using the code from the device. Ones that aren't highlighted, like that E in the bottom right, aren't doing anything at all. So you could easily map that to a different function. And when it comes to mapping that, you've got a few different options. So we'll take a look at what we can do if you say you want to map this E button. You can either learn from the original remote, or you can reassign. So if I press learn from original remote, just to demonstrate how learning works, you press learn, and what it then says is hold the button on the original remote that you want to learn. So what I'll do is I'll take the remote for the TV here, point it at the front of the Sofabaton, and just hold down one of the buttons. And as you can see, the progress bar goes along, and once it's done, it says learn key successfully. That's now learned that button that I pressed on this remote onto the Sofabaton. So now that E key is now highlighted in blue, and that will now work. So this means that if you can't get the quite perfect remote code for your device, but you can get something that works most of the time, if there's any weird buttons that that don't quite work, you can learn them from your original remote. The other thing you can do is reassign them. For example, I found that on this button here with like the menu kind of thing, that opens the TV settings menu. But there isn't a default button on this that opens the program guide. So if I want to open up the EPG and look at the program guide, there isn't actually a button on this remote currently for that. But what I can do is I could reassign that. So say, for example, I decide I don't really ever need to open the settings menu on this TV. Or if I do, in the rare situation, I'll just take the TV's own remote and use that. But what if instead I want that particular button there to open the EPG? Well, that's actually quite easily doable. What you can do is if you press on the button, instead of pressing learn from original remote, you can press reassign remote key. And this pulls up the TV and shows me every single function this TV has. So I can go through here and say, fine, I don't know, be guide or EPG, something that's a bit hard to work out what they're calling it because they give them all different names. But there we go, guide. So I can press guide, press done. And once that's uploaded, that's now reassigned. So it doesn't show it here, but now if I press this button, rather than opening the TV's menu, it's now opening the TV's program guide. So you can kind of remap functions, which is actually really useful. What's particularly useful about being able to remap keys is that it works cross-device. So as you can see, I've now added a skybox to this. And if you look at the remote, we can now see we're seeing the skybox showing up, and we can scroll down, up and down on this here, and that switches which device we're using. You don't need to press anything to select, it's literally scroll until the device you see is highlighted, and then that's the one you'll use. So that's how you pick devices. And with that now set up, we can go into Sky, press remote keys, and this shows all the keys that are assigned for the skybox. But as you can see here, the volume keys and mute aren't assigned. So that means if the remote's set to Office TV, the volume on the TV will be controlled as normal. But if it's set to Sky, the volume buttons won't do anything. But all I need to do is if I press that, I can press reassign, it'll show all the buttons on the skybox, fair enough. but I can pick Office TV, scroll through here, and go to volume up, done. Do the same for volume down, so reassign remote key, Office TV, volume down, done. And then finally mute. Reassign remote key, Office TV, mute, done. So with that, if this is set to Sky, these buttons will actually control the TV's volume directly. So this will send the infrared command to the TV, not the Skybox. So if you have an absolute ton of devices, you could do that for each of those. And it means that all of those devices, if you use, no matter what device you have selected, if you use the volume keys, they'll control your TV. Likewise, if you have some sort of soundbar or AV receiver, you could set it up and add that device's remote to this and assign the volume keys to control that. So even if your remote is set to control the TV, if you use the volume controls, it'll control your soundbar or AV receiver. Now, of course, you do have things like HDMI CEC, so generally speaking, those devices will kind of control each other. But sometimes those things don't work properly, the CEC isn't quite working, or you've got an old soundbar that only has an optical connection, not HDMI. So this can actually be really useful in those situations. You can remap keys across different devices. And of course here I demonstrated it on a key that wasn't normally used, so that the volume keys weren't assigned on Sky, but there'd be nothing stopping you saying going, I don't know, into the Office TV, going into the TV, and say in here saying, right, I want to reassign, I don't know, the play button, and reassign that to one of the buttons on the Skybox. Don't know why you would, but you can, even if a remote by default has a function on a particular button, you can easily remove that and reassign it to something else, which is really, really powerful. The final bit of functionality I want to demonstrate before I actually go and set this up and demonstrate it working with my home automation system is macros. And this lets you chain multiple commands together and assign them to a single button. So for example, we're on the Sky remote here, we can pick this input button, just as a rough example, and we can say create macro for this key. And we can say with this key, when it's pressed, I want it to first of all turn on the Skybox, or toggle the power on the Skybox anyway. And then I want it to go to commands database Office TV. And it turns out that my Office TV, in its IR commands, has individual commands to switch to different HDMI inputs. So not only is there a normal one that just opens up the HDMI, the input selection menu and lets you pick an input, I can actually explicitly say, switch to input HDMI 3. Of course, this will vary between TVs, but if I do that and save that, what will now happen if I press that input button in the top right, is it'll send a command to the Skybox to turn on, and then it'll send a command to my TV to switch the TV to a different HDMI input. And these macros are pretty flexible. There's time delays you can put in between if you kind of need devices to wake up in the right order. So these are also quite useful. Of course, bear in mind it is infrared, so if you've got a bunch of these commands with quite long delays in there, you will kind of need to keep pointing the remote at the thing that's receiving the command for the duration of the macro running. But that is also really nice functionality. So that's kind of really an overview of the app and how you configure this remote, and that's really most of the functionality it has. You can either pick commands from a database, you can learn commands from an existing remote, and you can assign commands across different remotes. So you can assign different device commands to different devices and things like that. It is pretty powerful. So there you go, that's a look at the app. Now, as you can see, I've done a fair bit more config here. We'll go into that in a minute, but that was just a quick look at the app, really to sort of show its features. And it's a good start for an app like this, and I kind of like some of the functionality they've put in, but it just feels a little bit incomplete. For example, it doesn't have a very good database of IR codes. It's got loads of devices, but not many current ones, so it gets a little bit tricky trying to find your device. The search function isn't great, and it just feels like it's lacking some features. For example, you can't export and import IR codes. So say, for example, you go through all the process of learning a remote and learning your remote into this. You can't export that or share it. What would be really good with this, and it would be such a simple feature to implement, is the ability to export IR codes to a file that could then be shared. Because there's already like a Sofabaton subreddit, and you can have people in there sharing codes. So even if Sofabaton doesn't have the code for your particular device, someone else could learn it into the remote, export the config, and you could import that. But there's no functionality to do that, which is really annoying. There also isn't the functionality to export and import config from a remote, which is really annoying for my setup here because I have 3 different remotes that are all controlling the same devices over a matrix distribution system. But there's no way for me to say set up one remote, export that config, re-import it into a different remote, and then just tweak it. I have to set up each remote completely from scratch, which takes significantly longer. So it'd be really nice if there's a way to export and import codes between remotes, or entire remote configs between remotes. But again, it doesn't have that. The final feature I found that's missing is if we say go into a remote here, you can reassign all the keys. So you can, for example, As you can see here, I have the volume buttons on all my remotes assigned to my AV receiver, and that works really well. But there's no way to say I want to change the volume control and the volume button on every single device to the same thing. I have to go into my Apple TV, set the volume control, up, down, mute, then go, once that's done, then go back out of this, then go into, say, the PS4, the remote keys, volume, reassign, and you have to do that for every single device. You can't just say, right, this set of buttons are common across all my devices and set them once. So it's little things like that that it seems to lack. You can't kind of batch edit stuff, you can't export and re-import configs, and you can't share and re-import other people's IR codes. So the app is very close to being perfect, it's just missing those slight features that would just kind of set it over the edge to actually being good. Right now, it's usable, but it's not amazing. So yeah, that's an overview of the app. What we'll now do is we'll take a look at my setup actually working, look at it controlling my home automation system and my matrix switching, and then we'll take a look at how I've set that up. Okay, so now let's take a look at this working. So I'll demonstrate with my bedroom TV just because it's easier to film in here. So here we have the remote. Now this is obviously the Sofabaton U1. The U2 is in the living room, but I may as well use the U1 here. It's basically the same setup on them all. But as you can see, we have all the devices set up. So we have the bedroom TV, which is the TV here, Sky, Apple TV, PS4 and PS5. So first of all, if we set this to bedroom TV and press the power button, the TV will turn on. That's not exciting, but it works. So it works controlling the TV. And likewise, with it set to bedroom TV, it will control the TV as normal. So it will just work like a normal TV remote. And this controls basically all the functions of the TV that I would want. So that's the controlling the TV, but that's not very exciting. As I mentioned in my previous video, I have an HDMI distribution system. So I have an HDMI matrix switch in the living room that connects to all my HDMI devices and distributes them to all the TVs. So what I've done with this is I've set it up to make it very easy to switch to those other devices. So as we can see on the remote here, we're currently set the bedroom TV using the option there, but I can switch down to Sky. Now with that set to Sky, this remote will control the Sky box. But how do I switch to the Sky box? Well, all I do is press this input button in the top right. If you watch what happens when I press that, the TV will switch to the HDMI input, the matrix switch will switch to the Sky box, and up comes Sky. And now I'm in here, if I use the remote with it set to Sky, that controls Sky. So the way this works is for each of the devices I have here, I've programmed a unique IR code for this button, for this input button. So there's a separate IR code for Sky, Apple TV, PS4, PS5, and then for each of the other remotes, those also have unique IR codes for each source on that button. And as I demonstrated in my other video, on each TV I have an IR blaster in the corner, and that's distributed over the Cat6 signal and emitted out of an IR blaster in the living room. So the IR receivers on each TV receive the IR remote codes from each TV's remote control and blast out in the living room at all the devices in the living room AV cabinet. One of those devices is a smart Tasmota-based IR blaster. So what that does is that receives the IR codes and bridges it over to my Node-RED and Home Assistant-based smart home using MQTT. I then have some logic in Node-RED that receives those IR codes and acts accordingly. And because this button on each remote has a unique IR code, when I receive the IR codes into Node-RED, I can easily tell which remote it comes from, so I know which room it's coming from, and which device is selected on that remote. So if I press this here, so say I set this to Apple TV and press this button, Node-RED will receive an IR code, and it knows that that IR code is related to the input button for Apple TV on the bedroom remote. Likewise, if I did this on my living room remote, it would know that that's the Apple TV code for the living room remote. And then it can send the appropriate commands to all the devices to switch all the inputs around. So as we can see, that's Sky working there, but there's obviously other devices, so I can scroll down to Apple TV, press the button, and then the TV will switch over to the Apple TV. There we go, screensaver's on, but we can wake that up, and that's now controlling the Apple TV. That works fine. Now, to control the Apple TV, I found that while there are IR codes on the Sofabaton for Apple TV, none of those actually worked. However, the way the Apple TV works is you're basically designed to program any IR remote. So if we go down here for Learn Remote, what you basically do is you go into here, like that, and it'll then ask you just to hold down the IR codes on your remote. So you hold down the up button, then hold down the down button, hold down left, hold down right, and so on. And that allows you to program any IR codes into the Apple TV. So that's how I set up the Apple TV on this. I picked one of the sets of Apple TV codes from the Sofabaton app, then I had to manually learn it in using the Apple TV interface. But that worked fine. The only downside though is that there's no way I can find on this to learn the power button. So even though the IR code set did have a power button code programmed in, that wouldn't turn the Apple TV on. So maybe that's for older Apple TVs, I'm not sure. And I couldn't figure out a way to set the Apple TV to learn a power button command. So with that, I could only turn the Apple TV on using its own remote, which wasn't exactly ideal. Now, I have figured out a solution, but again, it's a bit of a bodge that only works with my very custom setup, where once again, this power button is a unique IR code. So what happens is when I press this power button, that command once again goes through here, through to the Tasmota IR blaster and into Node-RED. And when Node-RED sees that the Apple TV power button's been pressed, it then sends a signal to my HDMI matrix switch over the network that issues a CEC power on command. So it powers on the Apple TV using the HDMI connection using a CEC command. So with that, I can actually power the Apple TV on using this remote, but it does have to go through the home automation system for that. So that's something to bear in mind if you were buying one of these Sofabaton remotes and you're planning to use it with an Apple TV. I haven't been able to find a way to allow this remote to turn the Apple TV on without using my existing home automation system. So if you're planning on having an out-of-the-box system without a lot of custom bodgery, this might not be able to power on an Apple TV, but I've been able to make it work. So of course that's the Apple TV. The final two devices we have here are PS4 and PS5. Now, of course, neither of those have actually set up for IR control. It might be possible, but it's not something I'm particularly interested in. These are purely for input switching. So for both of these, the only IR button programmed in is the input switching button. So if I switch to, say, PS5, press that button there, the matrix switch will switch over and we'll get the PS5. Like that. I think the screen's kind of dimmed, it's obviously going to sleep, but whatever, that's the PS5. So that's how I've got the PS4 and PS5 working. I've just added them as custom remotes to the Sofabaton, and I can just scroll to the particular device I want and press this button. So this setup actually works really, really well. I can very easily pick any device I want by just scrolling to the device on the Sofabaton, pressing this button, and that'll switch the TV to that source. It actually works really, really well. But it does require quite a lot of custom bodgery in the back end using that Tasmota-based IR blaster, Node-RED and Home Assistant and all that stuff to make it all work together. Of course, if you didn't have all that, you could still use this pretty well, but you might not have that automatic input switching to being as easy, and things like that Apple TV power on might be an issue for you. So that's important to bear in mind. Likewise, in the living room, I have a very similar setup. So for example, the TV is currently just on its own menu there. I can use that just to control the TV with this remote set to TV. Likewise, if I scroll this remote down to Sky, you can hopefully just make that out there. The camera's a bit slow at focusing, but you can see it's now set to Sky. If I then press the button in the top right, the TV will then switch to the HDMI input, and it'll switch over to Sky. Now, this TV doesn't have a very good smart integration. It apparently has an MQTT broker that I could connect to, but I can't seem to get that to work. So instead with this, what I've got is an automation set up in the Sofabaton remote. So it sends a unique IR code to trigger the HDMI matrix switch input changing, and then all it does is just send a command over IR to the TV to switch the TV to the HDMI input, and that works pretty well. So that's Sky. Likewise, I can switch the remote down to Apple TV, press the button, and then once again, it'll switch over to Apple TV. So it works just like the bedroom. So there we go, that's the Apple TV. There we go. Navigate the Apple TV just like I could in the bedroom. So that's a look at the AV setup in the living room, and it works basically the same as the bedroom. But there's a reason I'm in the living room showing this explicitly, and that's because not only do we have the AV setup on here, but I've also added lighting control. We'll take a look at how this is set up in a minute. Again, this is a bit of a bodge that's very custom. It's not the Sofabaton isn't designed for this. But if I switch this down to lighting here, and then point at my IR receiver, which is in this cabinet over here, and press the power button, the lights will all turn off. Likewise, if I point it down again, you can see the lights are off, but you can just make out the remote. If I press the power button again, the lights will all turn on again. The other thing I've added to this is scenes. So I've got 4 scenes set up, and I've assigned them to the number buttons. So numbers 1 to 4 will switch to different brightness scenes. So I think I'm already on scene 1, so if I press 2, that'll switch to a sort of cool white daylight kind of temperature. Like that, that's a lot brighter and a lot cooler. If I press 3, it'll dim down to a very dim kind of night light, very warm temperature. If I press 1, it'll go back to that regular sort of warm white, regular kind of relaxation lighting scene I normally have. And finally, if I press 4, it'll switch to colourful RGB lighting. These are the same scenes that I have on my in-wall touchscreens, but I've now moved them over to the TV remote as well. So if I'm sitting on the couch, I can just pick up the remote and control the lights. I don't have to get my phone out and open up the Home Assistant app. And this works really, really well. Now, of course, there's a bunch more stuff I could add to this. For example, I could set it up to so that the up and down arrows could control the brightness, and then left and right would control color temperature or something like that. I've not set that up yet. It's something I'll probably do in the future. But yeah, I've even added lighting control to this. So while on its own, it is just a basic IR remote. It doesn't really do that much sort of smart stuff. When combined with that IR receiver and Node-RED and Home Assistant, I can actually make this remote control any part of my home automation system. So yeah, even though it's not the most powerful device ever and the app isn't great, with enough customization, I've got a pretty cool setup here. So now I'm going to try and explain how all this works from a software perspective. Now, I'm not going to be able to go into too much detail in this and explain exactly how all this works so you can build it yourself. This is a very overcomplicated Node-RED and Home Assistant setup that I've built over many years, and it is a complete bodge in a lot of places. It's not going to be easy to explain. I do plan on at some point doing a dedicated video on this, but there's a lot more tidying up and polishing I want to do before I can really demonstrate it fully. But essentially what I have here is Node-RED, and this is essentially a kind of block-based programming, visual programming language type thing. So data flows between these blocks. Some of these are JavaScript functions, some of these are just kind of blocks that just split out based on values, and it kind of all works together and connects devices together. So you can see we receive IR commands here over MQTT. We have outputs over TCP, which are basically telnet connections to different devices. For example, my AV receiver and my HDMI matrix switch to control those. And data essentially passes through this flow, gets switched through various things, and passes out the end. So what happens is when I press a button on an infrared remote, it gets received by my Tasmota-based IR blaster, which bridges over MQTT and comes to this block here. So this block outputs the IR codes, and you can see them coming down on the right-hand side here. There's a lot of noise. It picks up random things as IR codes, which is what all these unknown ones are. If I clear that and I press a button on one of the TV remotes, so if I press the power, say the power button for the Apple TV, you can see it comes up here as protocol NEC, and as you can see we have a data and a data least significant bit. And these values here represent that IR code and are unique to that code. For example, if I press a different button on that remote, for example the button to switch to the Apple TV, you'll see we get a different code. So you can see the data and data LSB are different between the two. So each of those IR codes comes into this block here, and then it gets passed into these mapping blocks. These blocks are essentially JavaScript functions that match the data and data least significant bit values against a predetermined set of values and actions. So for example, if I press the button to turn on the Apple TV, I know that FB0048B7 and DF0012ED, if I receive both of those, that means it's the button press to turn on the Apple TV. Likewise, I have those for all different things. For example, I have a different mapping that maps for the input switch on the Apple TV. I have different ones for each room, so each room has its own set of buttons for the input switching, and it makes all the decisions, passes it through, and passes it out to the functions to control the various devices. I really need to do a better video on this at some point, but that's kind of how it works. Each of these buttons has a unique IR code, and this logic takes that IR code and turns it into actions. But the question is, how can I make certain buttons on this remote send out IR codes that I can use in this system that aren't necessarily IR codes that are designed to control a particular device? So if we take a look here at the Sofabaton app, what you can see is at the bottom of this list of devices, I have a device labeled Dummy1. This is a device for a remote for a random device. I think it's a random cable box. Essentially what I did was pick a device that I know I will never own. So I picked a device that's a brand I've never heard of, or a brand from a different country that is not sold in the UK, for example, and added one of the remotes. So we come into here, we have a remote with a bunch of buttons on it, but none of these buttons will map to any device that I actually own. What I then did is if we then say go onto the Apple TV, for example, remote keys, I needed to map this power button to an IR code that I could receive into Node-RED and use it to control the Apple TV over CEC. So what I did is this is the Apple TV remote. I came into here, pressed reassign remote key, and picked Dummy1. And then what I did is I picked one of the functions from this Dummy1 remote. So going back into that. So I picked the pause button on that Dummy1 remote. Therefore, when I press the power button on the Apple TV, that will send essentially the pause IR code for this Dummy1 remote, and that's unique and can be picked up by Node-RED. Likewise, if we look at the button to switch the input to the Apple TV, we can press that. This is a macro, and if we go into the macro, we can see the first macro is to trigger the play button on the dummy one remote, and then switch the TV to the HDMI input. Likewise, if we look at the Sky remote and go to remote keys here and edit macro, we can see once again we're triggering a button on the dummy remote, but this time we're triggering the info button, whereas with the Apple TV we trigger the play button. This means that those buttons have different IR codes. I can differentiate them in Node-RED and use that to trigger different inputs on the matrix switch. Likewise for lighting control, we can see we have lighting here, remote keys, and as you can see we have a fairly blank remote with just a few buttons assigned. And as you can imagine, if I click on, say, for example, 1 and go to reassign remote key, you can see I've just picked buttons from that dummy 1 remote again. So number 1 is assigned to button 5 on that. Power is assigned to number 6. I've just basically picked the numbers in order. Number 4 on that is assigned to number 2 on the dummy remote. Just basically picking out unique buttons from that dummy remote and assigning them to buttons. So for example, for lighting, the remote has none of its own buttons. All of the buttons on this are assigned to other buttons on that dummy remote. So that's kind of how I've set this up here. If you need a setup where you need unique IR codes that you want to map to custom actions, all you really need to do is add in a sort of dummy remote, just some random brand of remote that you don't care about, and use those IR codes and assign them to different buttons or macros on the other remotes. And what you can also do in here that's really neat is you can press this button to hide from remote screen. So what you can do is if there's a device that you want to remap buttons from, but you don't want it to show up as a device on the remote, you can tick that, and that means that device will not show up when you're scrolling through devices on your remote control. I've done the same for my AV receiver. All I care about on the AV receiver is controlling the volume, and I want to control the volume from all the other remotes. So I've added the AV receiver as a device, but then hidden that from the menu, so you don't actually see that as an item, but all the TV, the Skybox, all those devices have their volume buttons mapped to control the AV receiver. And then to keep track of this, all I've done is I've made a little sort of table here, and I've just mapped the dummy 1 remote, the model that it's for, so it's apparently a 1x1 212 NA0001, apparently it's a cable box. So that's the particular model of remote that I picked when I added the dummy remote. And then for each of the buttons, I've assigned what it's for. So you can see green is switch the office to the Apple TV. Yellow is switch the office to PS4. Record is switch the living room to PS4. Things like that. So I just keep this mapping here of all these buttons and what they're assigned to, and I can keep track of that, and that works absolutely fine. So that's kind of the setup I've gone for there. And then down the bottom here, I've also added a few little notes. For example, which particular model of devices I've picked for each thing, just because I can't pick my exact model of TV. And then any kind of little remappings I've done to the buttons to get them set up how I want. Just means that if a remote ever broke and I needed to completely recreate it from scratch, I could easily enough do it from this documentation. So yeah, that's kind of what I've got there. So that's kind of how I've done that there. Hopefully that made sense. It's a very complicated setup. Not in the sense that it requires a lot of brain power to set this up. It's more that it's a complete bodge and a mess, and there is no documentation for this, so it's very fiddly to set this up. And I know people are probably going to ask me to share my Node-RED flows, because quite a few people have asked. It's not that I don't want to, or I feel that it's some super secret information I can't possibly share. It's because that this has no documentation. I've not written any documentation that explains how this works. Even I've forgotten how a lot of this works. So while I could share the code for these flows, if you didn't have any documentation, this would make no sense. You would just get a bunch of mess and it would be completely impossible to figure out. So while I'd love to share all this, it would require me to write a huge amount of documentation, and I just don't have the time for that, to be honest. But yeah, that's kind of how I've made this work there. So hopefully if you're wanting to get a remote like this and use it to create kind of custom integrations like this could kind of at least set you on the right track to know what you're starting to look for. But yeah, that's the setup there. So there you go. That's a look at how I'm controlling my home automation system using these Sofabaton remotes. And they work pretty well. Now, of course, bear in mind, for a lot of the stuff in this video, I'm doing a very custom implementation, and I do plan to do a full in-depth video of my home automation system at some point fairly soon. So you're not going to get all the functionality I've demonstrated here just by buying these remotes. For example, there's no functionality out of the box in these that could control smart lights. I've had to build that custom functionality completely from scratch. However, as for being a universal remote, these are quite good. They're not anywhere close to the old Logitech Harmony system or anything like that. And they do lack a lot of modern devices in terms of IR codes, so you kind of have to bodge and find old devices, then reprogram certain buttons. But they're definitely a step up from the sort of traditional one-for-all type universal remote. Just being able to use that app to easily reassign buttons, remap buttons, and set up kind of macros is actually really useful functionality. It just feels like the app isn't kind of complete. Just those features that I mentioned that are missing would just really kind of set it over the edge and make it a really, really good app. But right now, It's okay, but it's not perfect. So yeah, hopefully you found this interesting, and if you're thinking about maybe getting these remotes, you kind of know what to expect, because the marketing makes them look very glossy, and they are pretty good, but again, not quite perfect. Or you might find it interesting how I'm using these to control my home automation system, because with this particular setup, it works so well, and I'm really, really happy with it. So there you go. Hopefully you found this interesting. And if you're interested in buying these, I've put links in the description. But for now, all that's left to say is thank you very much for watching.